Welcome to Nation to Nation. Hello, I'm Todd Lamirande. There is an inequality in Canada when it comes to child welfare. There's a wide difference between on-reserve and off-reserve funding. A human rights tribunal agreed in 2016, but it has taken 5 legal orders for the government to do something. Earlier this month, Indigenous Services Minister Jane Philpott announced an immediate end to the gap, set up a 24/7 1-800 helpline, and promised more funding in next week's federal budget. The one person who has been fighting on the side of the children for more than a decade is Cindy Blackstock, the Executive Director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society. She joins me now to talk about recent developments and the future. Welcome to Nation to Nation.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Now, after what happened earlier this month, are we finally seeing some light at the end of the tunnel?
I think we're seeing a little glimmer of light, but my view has always been is I have zero tolerance for inequities in services for First Nations children. I believe every one of our kids is sacred and every one of our kids is worth the money. And although we're starting to see, thanks to the tribunal's work and all of the First Nations communities and families and children who have advocated and stood with us during this long court battle, some inequality starting to close in child welfare and on Jordan's principle, we still have issues with education, early childhood, basics like water and sanitation that are going to continue to pile up on the hopes and dreams of children. So I want to see Canada adopt the Spirit Bear Plan and put an end to all of these inequalities and take the same approach I do, which is zero tolerance for any racial discrimination against little kids in public service provision.
So when you're talking about zero tolerance, obviously, I guess after the latest announcements by Philpott, you still don't think the government's quite in compliance with what the Human Rights Tribunal spelled out?
Well, I want to see what's actually in that budget. And I also want to see when the First Nations agencies send in their invoices for family support, I want to make sure that the government actually pays that in full instead of trying to nickel and dime it, as we've seen in the past. So I think there's some hope on the horizon, but as always, I measure hope at the level of children. I want to see changes happen for those children and families. And when we start to see that in a positive way, then I'll start to feel really encouraged.
Of course, Minister Philpott has promised to pay those invoices. It is still too early to determine whether that's happening.
I think it is, because the First Nations agencies only received a letter saying that they could bill for these services as of February 1st. So they would just be starting that process of billing, because normally they bill every month. So they'll be starting that process, and we'll start to see whether or not that actually is going to happen in reality.
Now, of course, there's been reports in the media that Philpott has talked to the Minister of Finance and is going to get a positive response from him when it comes to next week's budget. Are there specific things you're hoping to see in that budget?
Yeah, I want to see the Spirit Bear Plan actualized. I want to see them not only deal with the inequalities in child welfare and make a commitment that no matter how much it costs to end this inequality, that they're committed to do it, right? And I also don't want to see the money spread over 10 years or 5 years like we've seen in the past with the biggest investments in the back end. I want to see the biggest investments in kids right now, because they're growing up right now, right? They need those inequalities to end in child welfare right now. In addition to that, I'll be looking for investments in early childhood programs. That you saw that report that only 18% of kids get benefit from Aboriginal Head Start. It should be 100% of kids who have the option of going to Aboriginal Head Start. And then also the Parliamentary Budget Officer, as you know, Todd, did that review of education and found out even after all the investments for education in budget 2016 are accounted for, our kids are still getting less, and the gap in the condition of schools continues. So I'd like to see how they're going to fix that fully too.
Do the provinces need to come on board? We just saw a budget earlier this week from the BC budget, and they kicked some money, a few $100 million into, of course it was for everybody in the province, not just Indigenous. There was some money, for example, for Head Start in that province. But we need to see other provinces doing what they did.
Yeah, and I'd like to see the provinces adopt the Spirit Bear Plan. I mean, many of our community members live off reserve, and they need access to culturally based services that meet the distinct needs of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children and their families. I think the provinces really have not stepped up to the plate at the degree that they could. And they're failing to understand that, yes, it's going to cost a bit more in a short time, but every dollar you invest in a little child saves the government $20 downstream. And let's face it, how wonderful would it be if we saw the first generation of Métis, First Nations, and Inuit kids grow up healthy and proud of who they are without having to spend their whole childhoods fighting for equality. That would be a great day.
Now, of course, we've had these conversations with you many times about the inequality between on and off reserve. But off reserve, there's obviously a lot of inequality there. I mean, what's not being done, I suppose, to help those people in particular?
Well, when we look at child welfare in general, off reserve, the vast majority of children in care are First Nations kids, then Métis and Inuit children. But when we look at the services that they're providing, they're mainstream services. They're not adapted to those needs. There's also not an accounting of the housing conditions off reserve, or the availability of addiction services to get over the multi-generational trauma of residential schools. All of that has to be taken into account in the design of child welfare services off reserve, so that we hold people accountable for things that they can change, but we don't hold people accountable for things that are beyond their ability to control.
I suppose, are these the kinds of things that need to happen to close or get rid of the thousands of children who are in care right now? You know, as you know, there are probably more children in care now than there went to residential schools.
Yeah, and I mean, that's why, and for many, many decades, many of us felt we were screaming into silence about this, because we were saying what was happening right now is the crises before us. We have a chance to stop this from happening. That's why the tribunal's decision is really important. I think that when we look forward to kind of reforms in child welfare, we're going to have to see the provinces come on board, but they should be learning from First Nations agencies. Do you know that despite the fact that First Nations agencies have been so underfunded and often not got the support that they needed, they are actually far less likely to remove children than non-Indigenous agencies are. They're much more likely to provide culturally based support, work with extended family, and keep those kids safely in their homes. So I think the provinces have a lot to learn from those First Nations agencies.
I also want to talk a bit about this 1-800 helpline that was set up. I guess, can you explain, it's probably too early to say it's made a difference or not. It was just set up a few weeks ago, but what is it that's set out to do?
Well, you know, with Jordan's principle, a lot of people think it only applies to health, but it doesn't. It applies to education, it applies to early childhood services, health, social services, a whole wide array of things that kids need. So if you're a viewer and you're listening and you're thinking, man, I know a child who needs some of those services, then all you need to do any time of the day or night is call 1-855-JP-CHILD and refer that child for possible coverage under Jordan's principle. The government then has, in a vast majority of cases, a responsibility to get back to you within 48 hours and make sure that child has the services that they need. So everyone should be going to the phones and doing this, because what I found in Jordan's principle application across the country is we're seeing a lot of healthcare claims come forward, but I suspect there's a lot of kids in need in early childhood and education who would really benefit by receiving these services. And so community members, professionals, folks who love and care for children, you should all be calling that number.
Again, is it too early to say whether this is being effective? Of course, this number was
some,
just set up.
That's right, it's just been set up. I've seen some early figures coming out of the government that suggest that people are calling. And I think as people become more aware that this is available to them, and that there are time frames that are set by the tribunal that Canada needs to comply with to make sure that kids aren't languishing along while government red tape takes over, then I'm hoping we'll see a lot more calls going into that and kids getting the help they need.
So it sounds like you've been at this for a long time. You're not ready to retire, and the work isn't over yet.
The work isn't over yet. Spirit Bear is still well on the job, because I've always measured change at the level of children, and I don't think we're there yet. I think that we haven't fulfilled the promise that we have for them, which is to make sure that they have a childhood where they're healthy and proud and happy. That's when I'll start retiring.
Okay, well, I'm sure that's still a long ways off. Thank you, Ms. Blackstock, for doing this.
My pleasure.